There were many fantastic arcades where I grew up, and for a few precious years I played every big game, and Sega's Model 1 and 2 games were my favourites. The console wars may have been the landscape of gaming in the 90s, but the arcades were the frontier, and across that 3D horizon came one of the most legendary games of all time, Daytona USA. It was an instant hit, and in the anticipation for the 5th gen consoles, gamers all knew a home port was on the way. Arcade ports don't always go as planned however, and Sega ended up having a few attempts at bringing this particular game home. To do this properly, I need to show you the original game first, and I don't mean from an emulator. There's one oasis of arcade gaming left within reach for me, and it's the heart of gaming in Croydon. These custodians of the classic arcade have made a fantastic environment with lots of classic and newer games, and here I can play possibly my favourite cabinet ever, a twin-seater Daytona USA with force feedback steering wheels. Daytona was the first Model 2 game to be released internationally in 1994, and while Yu Suzuki was heavily involved, it was directed by Toshiro Nagoshi, who had been chief designer on the game's Model 1 predecessor Virtua Racing. Daytona is the natural progression from that game. It's fully texture mapped, the first game ever sold of texture filtering, 60 frames per second locked, up to 8-player link-up, and an infamous soundtrack by Takanobu Mitsuyoshi. The gameplay is much like Virtua Racing as well, 1 car and 3 tracks, but the handling model, drifting mechanic and sense of speed are light years ahead of anything else from the time, and this game is just as exciting to play now as it was over 20 years ago. The 3 tracks provide a nice increase in challenge, and the opponents are far more aggressive and require a lot more improvisation from the player than in its main contemporary, Ridge Racer. Daytona USA was and still is a triumph, and I urge anyone who has never played this game to track one down and tick it off their bucket list. Now, the importance of the Sega Model 2 board cannot be understated. Sega were losing the arms race at home to Nintendo, and of course the Saturn struggle would mostly be because of its lack of power compared to the PlayStation. But Model 2 stunned gamers and critics alike, and kept Sega at the forefront of arcade technology during a close battle with their main adversary, Namco. As Namco's games were lined up to release on PlayStation, so too gamers knew Sega's hits would come to the soon-to-be-released Saturn. Model 1 ports had been a mixed bag, largely because suitable target platforms weren't available for them. Daytona USA was even announced for the 32X at one point, but unsurprisingly that disappeared quickly. A lot of fun can be had across these ports, but the Saturn promised far more power and capability, and after a successful launch in Japan off the back of Virtua Fighter 1, Sega lined up Daytona USA to launch their new powerhouse console in the West. As you can immediately see, the first port of Daytona USA is not that successful, and there are good reasons for this. After the very quick port of Virtua Fighter 1, AM2's Saturn division was split into 3 teams, each developing ports of Virtua Fighter 2, Virtua Cop and Daytona at the same time. Daytona proved to be the most technically demanding, and to hit the Saturn's US launch in '95, Sega took programmers from the Virtua Fighter 2 team, pushing that port back. The headline issue is obviously the graphics. The arcade's 60 frames per second has been dropped to 20 at best, the polygon count drastically lowered, and the draw distance pulled in awfully close, creating very distracting pop-up. Daytona on Saturn reviewed well enough at the time and sold well on release, but the cutbacks were extreme and it didn't go unnoticed by reviewers. In Europe we also got some heavy borders due to poor optimization, and overall you could tell the development time just wasn't enough. What works well in this port, however, is that it's actually really faithful to the arcade original. In many ways you are getting the arcade game at home. It tries to replicate the colourful style, the soundtrack is actually better overall, due to the Model 2 board playing sequences of sound loops rather than whole tracks. But the impact the frame rate has is huge, and added to the messy polygon clipping, it becomes very difficult to judge the speed of your drifts, which makes it far less enjoyable than the arcade version. It's a shame that Sega released Daytona USA on the Saturn in such a sad state, but look at what this first gen Saturn title is trying to replicate. High-speed polygons, perspective correct texture maps, 40 cars on track. Even in your wildest dreams, it's difficult to imagine this port could have been any better. Fans of the game still say this port has it where it counts, in faithful handling and gameplay, but I disagree. Ultimately, this port was a big fail, and that had implications for the Saturn's future. It's worth bearing in mind that Daytona USA was the Saturn's premier game in the West, seeing as Virtua Fighter didn't hold the same level of appeal as it did in Japan. So to put this port into context, it went head to head with Ridge Racer on the PlayStation. You can argue all day long that in the arcade, Ridge Racer is a technically simpler game than Daytona, and I would agree, but that wasn't the point. Ridge Racer on the PlayStation is a better port, and unfortunately for Sega, it set the narrative very early that the PlayStation was better at 3D than the Saturn, a narrative that Sega never came back from. Sega had already repaired some of the damage of Virtua Fighter 1's lackluster Saturn port with Virtua Fighter Remix, and so after their incredible port of Sega Rally, AM3 developed a second port of Daytona USA using that game's engine in 1996. Right away, Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition is easier to look at, and the benefits of a far improved game engine are obvious. AM3 upped the frame rate to a fairly solid 30, pushed the draw distance back, and we even got a PAL optimised release in Europe. These are features gamers reasonably expected of the original port, and this game should be fantastic, but once you start playing it feels wrong very quickly. The engine is obviously geared towards Sega Rally, and the handling model here is completely different to what you would expect from Daytona. The colour scheme is rather bland and muddy, the same sense of speed just isn't there. New content has been added with 8 selectable cars at the start and 2 additional tracks, but this game just doesn't feel right at all. It's another shame because while in many ways Championship Circuit Edition is a far better use of the Saturn, it's actually a far worse port overall, and I prefer the original rushed launch game to this pretender. Again, Championship Circuit Edition reviewed fairly well at the time, but by late '96 the Saturn's fate was already sealed. With some exceptions such as an unbelievable port of Virtua Fighter 2, arcade ports had consistently been more successful on PlayStation than on Saturn. Added to the larger market on PlayStation and Sony's earlier adoption of longer form games, Sega's arcade ports just weren't the system sellers they had hoped for. Of course, Sega had pushed on in the arcades, and their Model 3 board had already released by the end of '96, with Virtua Fighter 3 being the headline title. Model 3 would last until the end of the decade, and Daytona USA 2 was released on the board in '98. You could surely expect a port of this on Sega's upcoming next-gen console, the Dreamcast. But apart from a series of rumours, a port was never officially announced. What we did get instead was Sega's third attempt at a port of the original. In 2001, Sega released Daytona USA 2001, co-developed by the newly formed dev team Amusement Vision and Genki, who worked on the disappointing port of Virtua Fighter 3 for the Dreamcast launch. Daytona USA 2001 is a massive step up from what we got on the Saturn, and with the power of the Dreamcast came a mostly solid 60 frames per second Daytona at home, with higher res textures and a much further draw distance than even the arcade original. It just looks fantastic and comes close to Daytona USA 2's visuals. The aesthetic even looks closer to the original than the Saturn ports, although maybe they went a bit far with the surface reflections. Problems are raised again however once you start playing, and just as with the Championship Circuit Edition, the controls feel completely different to the original. Surely the first Saturn port isn't still the best playing port of Daytona USA at this point. Well, fortunately I found that if you lower the steering sensitivity all the way, the game handles much better, and it does feel much closer to the arcade game than before. There's some more new tracks in a championship mode as well, but I'm not too fussed about that. It's an often overlooked game, but I've always enjoyed Daytona USA 2001. It's still very much an adaptation of the source material, rather than a direct port like the first Saturn Daytona, but it's way more enjoyable to play, and like many arcade ports on the Dreamcast, holds up flawlessly today. Although the Dreamcast burned bright, its light faded quickly, and the console was actually discontinued before Daytona USA 2001 even released in Europe. The tech behind the Dreamcast would live on in Sega's Naomi system, an arcade board that succeeded the model boards and lasted until 2009. but the arcades were fading fast after the turn of the millennium, and as Sega repositioned themselves as a third-party developer, their arcade franchises began leaning more heavily on home releases. By 2011, Sega's arcade games of the 90s had become distinctly retro, something they kind of encouraged with re-releases on PlayStation 2 in Japan under their Sega Ages label. They would have one final attempt at Daytona USA though, and this time it would be a proper restoration of the kind we haven't really seen of any game from that period. Ten years on from Daytona USA 2001, the best port of the original game came to PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, simply and appropriately called Daytona USA. It's the arcade game but better, a HD resolution, less popping, online play. It's like the ultimate version of Daytona. Stripped of all the added tracks and handling models, it just feels pure. The car models look more like their lower polygon arcade versions rather than the updated 2001 machines. The colours finally match the arcade and the sense of speed is perfect. I got the game on PS3 and the handling model translates very well to the controller and I can perform the drifts exactly as I'm used to. I'm sure a properly set up steering wheel would be even better, but this really is as close as I've seen to playing the arcade game at home. Playing this even makes you dream of what else Sega could do. Could we get other games from the era updated like this? Imagine a compilation of Daytona, Sega Rally, Virtua Fighter 2, Virtual Cop, hell, Top Skater. The sky's the limit when you have a conversion as good as this. I'm aware of the games I haven't considered in this video. The PC editions of the Saturn games, Sega Racing Classic, which was kind of a re-release in the arcades, and the obscure port on the Tiger R-Zone. But as always, I want to focus on the home console ports. When considered together, the ports of Daytona USA make for an uneven set of releases, and perhaps that's why Sega kept going back to it, to ensure that the job was finished. The original Saturn release became a poison chalice as it stood next to Ridge Racer. Championship Circuit Edition served its purpose for those who cared. And 2001 was a strange release, considering fans were rightly expecting Daytona USA 2 on their Dreamcasts. But the PlayStation 3 port was a direct hit and blows any expectations of a home port out of the water. Sega's promise was always to bring the arcade home, but in Daytona USA, Sega found their white whale, a game so advanced they presented themselves with the impossible task of bringing it to home consoles. It's strange that it took this long, but 18 years after Daytona USA was first shown to a select few in Japan, we finally got a home port that did the legend justice. If you've watched this far, thank you so much, and please like and subscribe if you liked the video. Tell me what you think of these or other Sega ports in the comments, and until the next time, happy gaming.